Sarah Martinez had always been invisible. At 28, she had perfected the art of blending into the background, of making herself so unremarkable that people's eyes would slide right past her without a second glance. It wasn't intentional at first, it had started as a survival mechanism during her turbulent childhood, growing up in foster homes where being noticed often meant being hurt. Now, as she sat in the corner of Murphy's bar wearing her usual oversized sweater and jeans, nursing the same beer she'd been holding for an hour, Sarah watched the Friday night crowd with the detached interest of an anthropologist studying a foreign culture. The bar was packed with the usual mix of college students, office workers, and locals, all laughing and shouting over the music, all part of a world that seemed to exist on the other side of an invisible barrier. Murphy's wasn't Sarah's usual hangout. She preferred quiet coffee shops or the solitude of her small apartment where she worked as a freelance graphic designer. But tonight was different. Tonight marked exactly 3 years since she'd been discharged from the army, and, despite her best efforts to forget, the anniversary always hit her like a physical blow. She had been a different person then, confident, capable, part of something bigger than herself. Staff Sergeant Sarah Martinez of the 101st Airborne Division had been someone who mattered, someone whose voice carried weight. But that was before everything fell apart, before the incident that ended her military career and left her questioning everything she thought she knew about honor, loyalty, and truth. The beer tasted bitter in her mouth as she remembered that last day in Afghanistan. The explosion that had rocked their convoy. The confusion and chaos that followed. The accusations that came after. Sarah closed her eyes, trying to push away the memories, but they crashed over her like a tide she couldn't stop. "Hey, isn't that table free now?" Sarah looked up to see 3 young men in expensive suits pointing at the high-top table next to her corner booth. They didn't wait for an answer, just swooped in and claimed it, their voices already raised in animated conversation about stock options and weekend plans in the Hamptons. One of them, a blonde guy who looked like he'd stepped out of a catalog, noticed Sarah watching and gave her a dismissive once-over before turning back to his friends. "God, this place is really going downhill. Look at the type of people they let in now." His comment was clearly meant for her to hear, and Sarah felt the familiar burn of humiliation in her chest. She started to gather her things, ready to disappear back to her apartment where she belonged, when the bar's atmosphere suddenly shifted. A group of men had just walked through the front door, and their presence seemed to ripple through the crowded space like a stone dropped in still water. There were 6 of them, all wearing casual clothes, but there was something unmistakably military about the way they carried themselves, the straight spines, the alert eyes that automatically scanned the room, the easy confidence that came from years of training and brotherhood. Sarah recognized the type immediately. Special operations, most likely Navy SEALs based on their bearing and the subtle tattoos she could glimpse on their forearms. Her heart rate picked up involuntarily, a mixture of respect and painful nostalgia washing over her. The blonde suit guy had noticed them too, and he was already straightening his tie and checking his reflection in his phone screen. "Now those are some real heroes," he said loudly, clearly hoping to be overheard. "Not like some people who probably never even left the country." Sarah's hands tightened around her beer bottle. She knew she should leave now, before the memories got worse, but something kept her rooted in place. Maybe it was masochistic curiosity, or maybe it was the part of her that still remembered what it felt like to belong somewhere. The SEALs made their way to the bar, ordering drinks and settling into easy conversation. Sarah couldn't help but watch them, noting the way they unconsciously positioned themselves to have clear sightlines to all exits, the way they included the youngest member of their group in the conversation without making it obvious, the quiet professionalism that radiated from them even in civilian clothes. The blonde suit guy was practically vibrating with excitement now. He'd clearly had a few drinks already, and his voice was getting louder with each passing minute. "You know, I was actually thinking about joining the military when I was younger," he announced to his friends, though his eyes kept darting toward the SEALs. "But my father convinced me that my talents were better used in the private sector. Making real money, you know? Contributing to the economy." His friends nodded along, but Sarah could see the calculation in their eyes. They were humoring him, probably used to his need for attention and validation. The blonde, she'd heard one of his friends call him Trevor, was the type who'd never been told no, never had to work for anything, never had to prove himself in any meaningful way. Trevor's voice grew even louder as he warmed to his theme. I mean, don't get me wrong, I respect what these guys do. But, let's be honest, most military people are just looking for a way to get their education paid for or escape whatever dead-end situation they come from. It's not exactly the cream of the crop we're talking about here. Sarah felt something cold settle in her stomach. She'd heard variations of this speech before, usually from people who'd never been within 100 miles of a combat zone, who had no idea what it meant to put your life on the line for people who would never know your name. One of the SEALs, a tall man with dark hair and serious eyes, had glanced over at Trevor's table. Sarah could see the slight tightening around his eyes, the way his jaw clenched almost imperceptibly. But he turned back to his drink without saying anything, the picture of professional restraint. Trevor, emboldened by what he interpreted as indifference, decided to take his performance up a notch. And don't even get me started on all these fake veterans running around, trying to cash in on some stolen valor. You've got people claiming they were special forces when they probably never made it past basic training. It's pathetic, really. The words hit Sarah like a physical slap. She thought about the discharge papers hidden in her desk drawer, the recommendation letters from her commanding officers that praised her service and dedication, the Purple Heart she'd earned when an IED had left her with a concussion, and shrapnel scars that still ached when it rained. None of it mattered now. She was just another invisible nobody in an oversized sweater, and people like Trevor would always assume the worst. She stood up abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. Several people glanced her way, including Trevor, who gave her another dismissive look. Sarah grabbed her jacket and headed for the door, desperate to escape before the walls closed in completely. But, as she passed Trevor's table, she heard him make one final comment that stopped her in her tracks. "Look at that one," he said with a laugh. "Probably thinks she's some kind of warrior princess. I bet she's never even seen the inside of a gym, let alone a battlefield." Sarah stood frozen for a moment, her back to Trevor and his friends. She could feel the eyes of the other patrons on her, could sense the expectant hush that had fallen over their section of the bar. This was the moment where she would either slink away in shame or turn around and make a scene that would only confirm Trevor's assumptions about her. She chose a third option. Without turning around, without raising her voice, she spoke clearly enough for everyone nearby to hear. "You're right about one thing," she said quietly. "There are a lot of people who lie about their military service. But there are also a lot of people who served with honor and came home to find that their country had already forgotten them." Trevor laughed, a sharp, ugly sound. "Oh, here we go. Let me guess, you're one of those forgotten heroes, right? What did you do, spend 6 months filing paperwork at some air-conditioned base in Germany?" Sarah finally turned around, and, for just a moment, the mask slipped. The woman who had been invisible seconds before was replaced by someone harder, someone who had seen things that would haunt Trevor's nightmares, someone who had carried wounded soldiers to safety under enemy fire and held the hands of dying friends in Afghan hospitals. But, the moment passed, and Sarah's shoulders slumped again. What was the point? People like Trevor would never understand, would never see past their own assumptions and prejudices. She was about to turn away again when she heard a new voice cut through the tension. "Actually," said the tall SEAL with the serious eyes, "I'm curious to hear her story." The bar had gone completely quiet now, every conversation stopped, every eye focused on their little drama. Sarah felt her face burn with embarrassment, but there was something in the SEAL's tone that wasn't mocking or dismissive. It was respectful, professional, the tone of one soldier addressing another. Trevor, clearly annoyed at having his spotlight stolen, scoffed. "Come on, man. Look at her. Does she look like someone who's seen combat? I mean, be serious." The SEAL's eyes never left Sarah's face. "Appearances can be deceiving," he said quietly. "Some of the bravest people I know don't look like what civilians expect soldiers to look like." Sarah felt something crack open in her chest, a tiny fissure in the wall she'd built around herself. Here was someone who understood, someone who knew that heroism didn't always come in the expected package. But, before she could respond, Trevor's voice cut through the moment like a blade. "Oh, please. You're just being polite. There's no way someone like her." "Someone like what?" The seal's voice had gone dangerously quiet, and Sarah could see the other seals shifting slightly, their casual posture becoming something more alert and ready. Trevor, drunk on his own arrogance and the attention he was getting, pushed forward. Someone weak. Someone who looks like she'd run at the first sign of trouble. I mean, come on, if she was really some kind of badass soldier, wouldn't she have said something by now? Wouldn't she defend herself? The silence that followed was deafening. Sarah could feel tears pricking at the corners of her eyes, but she blinked them back furiously. She wouldn't give Trevor the satisfaction of seeing her cry, wouldn't confirm his assumptions about her weakness. But, as she stood there, preparing to leave with what little dignity she had left, something unexpected happened. The seal took a step forward, his eyes locked on Trevor's face with an intensity that made several people step back. "You want to know why she hasn't defended herself?" he said, his voice carrying clearly through the silent bar. "Because she doesn't have anything to prove to you. Because real soldiers don't need to beat their chests and tell war stories to impress strangers in bars. Because she's got more class and professionalism in her little finger than you've got in your entire body." Trevor's face had gone red, but, whether from anger or embarrassment, Sarah couldn't tell. "You don't even know her," he sputtered. "You're just making assumptions, am I?" The seal smiled then, but it wasn't a friendly expression. "Tell me, what's the longest you've ever been away from home? What's the most dangerous thing you've ever done? Have you ever had someone shoot at you? Have you ever had to make a decision where someone's life hung in the balance?" Trevor's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. The bar was so quiet that Sarah could hear the ice clinking in someone's drink across the room. The seal nodded as if Trevor's silence was answer enough. Then, he did something that made Sarah's heart stop. He turned to face her fully, came to attention, and, in a voice that carried the weight of military tradition and brotherhood, he called out words that she never thought she'd hear again. "Crimson Arrow, front and center." The words hit Sarah like lightning. Crimson Arrow. Her call sign from Afghanistan. A name she hadn't heard spoken aloud in 3 years, a name that belonged to a different version of herself, a version she thought had died in the Afghan desert along with so many others. Her legs nearly buckled. How could this seal possibly know her call sign? Only a handful of people had ever been privy to that information, and most of them were either dead or had moved on to classified assignments where they'd never cross paths with a random Navy SEAL in a civilian bar. The entire bar seemed to hold its breath as Sarah stared at the tall SEAL. His serious eyes were studying her face with an intensity that made her feel exposed, as if he could see right through the careful facade she'd built over the past 3 years. There was recognition there, but also something else, respect, maybe even admiration. I don't know what you're talking about," Sarah managed to whisper, but her voice betrayed her. It was the voice of someone whose world had just been turned upside down. The seal took a step closer, and Sarah could see the details of his face more clearly now. Mid-30s, maybe, with the kind of weathered features that spoke of years spent in harsh environments. There was a small scar above his left eyebrow, and, when he moved, she caught a glimpse of a tattoo on his forearm, the trident of the SEALs, but with something else underneath it that she couldn't quite make out. "Commander Jake Morrison," he said quietly, offering his hand. "SEAL Team 6. And you, Staff Sergeant Martinez, are somewhat of a legend where I come from." Sarah's world tilted on its axis. SEAL Team 6, the most elite of the elite. And he knew her rank, her real rank, not the diminished version that existed only in her nightmares now. Trevor, who had been watching this exchange with growing confusion and irritation, finally found his voice. "What the hell is going on here? What's Crimson Arrow supposed to mean?" Commander Morrison never took his eyes off Sarah as he answered. "Crimson Arrow was the call sign of one of the finest soldiers I never had the privilege to serve alongside. Someone who saved more lives than most people could count, who showed the kind of courage under fire that gets written about in military journals for decades." Sarah shook her head frantically. "You don't understand. I'm not that person anymore. I got discharged. I failed." "You failed?" Morrison's voice cut through her protests. "Is that what you think happened over there?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Sarah could feel the weight of every pair of eyes in the bar, but, suddenly, they didn't matter. Nothing mattered except the disbelief and anger she could see building in Morrison's expression. "I know exactly what happened to you, Sergeant Martinez," he continued, his voice growing harder. "I know about Operation Sandstorm. I know about the convoy ambush. I know about the choice you made that saved 17 lives and ended your career." Sarah felt the blood drain from her face. Operation Sandstorm was classified, had been classified since the day it went sideways. How could Morrison possibly know those details? Trevor, sensing that he was losing control of his audience, tried to interject again. "Look, I don't know what kind of stolen valor fantasy this is." Morrison turned to Trevor with such sudden intensity that the younger man actually stumbled backward. "Stolen valor?" His voice was deadly quiet. "You want to talk about stolen valor?" He turned back to Sarah, and, when he spoke again, his voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. "Tell them about the children, Sergeant. Tell them about the school." Sarah's hands began to shake. The memory was there, always there, playing on an endless loop in her darkest moments. The intelligence that had come in wrong. The convoy route that was supposed to be clear. The IED that had been meant for them but had instead torn through a school bus full of Afghan children. "Commander, please," she whispered, but Morrison wasn't done. "Tell them how you disobeyed a direct order from your commanding officer. How you broke protocol and endangered your entire unit to save those kids." The words came flooding back, carried on Morrison's relentless voice. Sarah remembered the moment of decision, standing in the middle of that dusty road with explosions echoing off the mountains around them. Her CO had been screaming at her through the radio to maintain position, to wait for backup, to follow procedure. But there had been children trapped in that burning bus, and every second they waited was another second those kids might not survive. "She went in alone," Morrison continued, his eyes never leaving Sarah's face. "No backup, no air support, no idea if there were more IEDs waiting. Just her and her medic training and a determination to save every life she could." Sarah closed her eyes, but she couldn't shut out the memories. The heat of the flames against her face. The weight of the children as she carried them one by one to safety. The shrapnel that had torn through her shoulder when a secondary explosion rocked the bus just as she was pulling out the last child. 11 children, Morrison said softly. All under the age of 10. All alive today because one American soldier decided that following orders was less important than saving lives. Trevor's face had gone pale. The cocky arrogance had drained away, replaced by something that might have been shame if he was capable of such an emotion. But, if she saved all those kids, why was she discharged? Why isn't she some kind of hero? Morrison's laugh was bitter. Because politics don't care about dead Afghan children. Because her commanding officer needed someone to blame for the intelligence failure that led to that ambush. Because it was easier to court-martial a sergeant for disobeying orders than to admit that the entire operation was fundamentally flawed from the beginning. Sarah felt something break loose inside her chest, a dam that had been holding back 3 years of guilt and grief and rage. "I cost my unit their mission," she said quietly. 6 soldiers died in that ambush because I made the wrong choice. You made the only choice, Morrison shot back. Those soldiers died because of bad intel and poor planning, not because you saved children. Every single member of your unit who survived that day went on record defending your actions. Your medic, Corporal Jackson, submitted a formal commendation recommending you for the Medal of Honor. Sarah's head snapped up. That's not. Danny never told me. Danny Jackson is a good friend of mine, Morrison said gently. We served together before he transferred to the army. He's the one who told me about Crimson Arrow. About the soldier who threw away her career to save a busload of kids that nobody else even knew existed. The bar had gone completely silent. Sarah could hear her own heartbeat pounding in her ears, could feel tears streaming down her face that she didn't remember starting to cry. Trevor, looking like he wanted to disappear into the floor, finally found the courage to speak. I'm sorry. I didn't know. I thought. You thought what? Morrison's attention swung back to him like a weapon. You thought that heroism comes with a specific look? You thought that real soldiers spend their time in bars bragging about their service records? He gestured toward Sarah, who was still standing frozen in the middle of the room. This woman has more courage in her little finger than you'll have in your entire lifetime. She's the kind of person who runs toward danger when everyone else is running away. The kind of person who chooses what's right over what's easy, even when it costs her everything she's worked for. Sarah wanted to protest, wanted to explain that she wasn't a hero, that she was just a washed-up ex-soldier who couldn't even get through a Friday night without falling apart. But Morrison wasn't finished. You want to know what stolen valor looks like? He asked Trevor. It's sitting in a bar talking about how you almost joined the military. It's judging people based on their appearance instead of their actions. It's assuming that because someone doesn't look like your idea of a warrior, they must not be one. Trevor's friends had abandoned him now, sliding away from their table and disappearing into the crowd. He stood alone, facing down a Navy SEAL commander who looked like he could tear him apart without breaking a sweat. I think you owe the sergeant an apology, Morrison said quietly. Trevor nodded frantically. Yes, absolutely. I'm sorry, ma'am. I was completely out of line. I had no right to say those things. But Sarah barely heard him. Her attention was focused entirely on Morrison, on the impossible fact that he knew her story, knew details that should have been buried in classified files somewhere in the Pentagon. How? She asked quietly. How do you know all this? Morrison smiled for the first time since he'd entered the bar, and it transformed his entire face. Because 3 years ago, a certain army sergeant's actions in Afghanistan saved the life of a man who would later become very important to a lot of people. One of those children you pulled from that bus? His name was Ahmad Hassan. His father is now a key ally in our ongoing operations in the region. That little boy grew up to become one of our most valuable assets, and every piece of intelligence he provides, every life he helps us save, traces back to what you did that day. Sarah felt like the world was spinning around her. Ahmad. I remember him. He had a broken arm. He wouldn't stop crying for his mother. He's 16 now, Morrison said gently. Speaks fluent English, wants to become a doctor. His family specifically requested that any Americans working in their area be told about the soldier who saved their son. They call you the Angel of Crimson Arrow. The tears were coming faster now, and Sarah didn't try to stop them. 3 years of believing she had failed, 3 years of thinking that her sacrifice had been meaningless, 3 years of carrying the weight of those 6 soldiers' deaths, and now this stranger was telling her that it had all meant something after all. But the court-martial, she began, was a political necessity that had nothing to do with justice, Morrison finished. Your CO needed a scapegoat, and you were convenient. But every soldier who matters knows the truth about what you did. You're mentioned by name in 3 separate field manuals as an example of combat heroism. There are officers at Bragg who still use your actions as a case study in ethical decision-making under fire. Sarah sank into the nearest chair, overwhelmed by the revelation that her story hadn't ended in shame and disgrace after all. That somewhere, people still remembered Crimson Arrow as something more than a cautionary tale about the dangers of disobeying orders. Morrison pulled out his phone and showed her the screen. It was a photo of a young man in traditional Afghan dress, standing next to what looked like a newly built school. He was smiling broadly, holding a certificate of some kind. Ahmad's graduation from the English language program we helped establish in his village, Morrison explained. He insisted on holding it in front of the school that replaced the one destroyed in the ambush. He says he's going to become a doctor so he can save lives like the American soldier who saved him. Sarah stared at the photo through tears that blurred her vision. The little boy with the broken arm had grown into a confident young man with his whole future ahead of him. A future that existed because she had chosen to disobey orders and risk everything to pull him from a burning bus. I never knew, she whispered. I thought it was all for nothing. Morrison reached out and gently took her hand. Ma'am, with all due respect, you need to understand something. What you did that day wasn't a failure. It was exactly what every soldier dreams of being able to do: save innocent lives, even at personal cost. You didn't fail your mission. You exceeded it. The other SEALs had moved closer now, forming a loose circle around Sarah and Morrison. She could see respect in their eyes, the kind of recognition that one warrior gives to another. These were men who had seen combat, who understood the weight of life and death decisions, and they were looking at her like she belonged among them. One of them, a shorter man with graying hair and kind eyes, stepped forward. "Ma'am, if I may, I'm Master Chief Petty Officer Rodriguez. I was wondering if you might consider joining us for dinner. We'd be honored to hear more of your story." Sarah looked around at their faces, serious, respectful, genuinely interested in who she was rather than what she looked like. For the first time in 3 years, she felt like she was being seen for who she really was instead of who she appeared to be. But, even as part of her wanted to accept their invitation, another part was still trapped in the shame and guilt that had defined her civilian life. "I appreciate the offer," she said quietly, "but I'm not sure I'm the person you think I am." "Not anymore." Morrison's grip on her hand tightened slightly. "With respect, Sergeant, you're exactly who I think you are. The question is, are you ready to remember who that is?" Sarah found herself sitting in a booth at an all-night diner 2 blocks from Murphy's Bar, surrounded by 6 Navy SEALs who were treating her like visiting royalty. The contrast between this moment and where she'd been an hour ago felt surreal, like she'd stepped through some kind of portal into an alternate universe. Commander Morrison sat across from her, nursing a cup of black coffee and studying her with those serious eyes. The other SEALs, Rodriguez, Thompson, Chen, Williams, and a young petty officer named Parker who couldn't be much older than 25, had arranged themselves around the table with the unconscious precision of men accustomed to working as a team. "I still can't believe Danny Jackson never told you about the commendation," Morrison said, shaking his head. "That man wrote a 15-page detailed account of your actions that day. I've read it probably a dozen times. According to him, you carried 11 children to safety over the course of 43 minutes while under intermittent enemy fire, treating their injuries as you went and keeping them calm in 3 different languages." Sarah stared down at her coffee, the memories coming back in waves. "Danny exaggerates. And I only speak English and basic Pashto, not 3 languages." "Sign language," Rodriguez said quietly. "According to the report, one of the children was deaf. You communicated with her using sign language while you treated her burns." Sarah's head snapped up. She had forgotten about Fahima, the little girl who had been so terrified and confused because she couldn't hear the explosions or understand why everyone was screaming. Sarah had learned basic ASL in high school when her foster sister had been born with hearing loss, and she'd used every sign she could remember to calm Fahima down and get her to safety. "You remember her," Morrison observed. "The deaf girl." "Fahima," Sarah whispered. "She was maybe 7 years old. She kept trying to go back for her school bag." Thompson, a massive man with arms like tree trunks, leaned forward. "That school bag contained the only photo she had of her mother, who had died the year before. Her teacher told our interpreter that Fahima carried it everywhere because she was afraid she'd forget what her mother looked like." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. She had wondered about that school bag, had seen how desperately the little girl had wanted to retrieve it, but there hadn't been time. The bus had been on the verge of exploding, and every second counted. "I couldn't get it for her," Sarah said, her voice breaking slightly. "I wanted to, but you made the right choice," Morrison interrupted gently. "You saved her life. And, according to our latest intelligence, Fahima is now attending a school for the deaf in Kabul. She's learning to read and write, learning computer skills, building a future that wouldn't exist if you had gone back for that bag." Chen, who had been quiet up until now, pulled out his phone and scrolled through something. "Actually, Commander, there's something else you should know." He handed the phone to Sarah. This was taken last month. The photo showed a group of young women in school uniforms, all making the same sign language gesture with their hands. In the center of the group was a teenage girl with bright, intelligent eyes and a wide smile. Even though she was older now, Sarah recognized her immediately. "That's the sign for thank you," Sarah said softly, her knowledge of ASL coming back to her. "They're all saying thank you. It's become a tradition at their school, Chen explained. Every year on the anniversary of the bus attack, they make that sign in a group photo and send it to the American base. They call it Angel Day in honor of the soldier who saved their classmate. Sarah stared at the photo, overwhelmed by the realization that her actions had rippled out in ways she never could have imagined. These girls had probably never heard of Crimson Arrow, didn't know her name or her story, but they were honoring her sacrifice in their own way. "I don't understand," she said finally. "If all this is true, if what I did actually mattered, then why did everything fall apart so badly? Why the court-martial? Why the discharge?" Morrison's expression grew grim. "Politics. Your commanding officer that day was Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Webb. Ring any bells?" Sarah's stomach dropped. "He's a general now. I saw him on the news a few months ago, talking about military efficiency and the importance of following proper protocols. General Webb's entire career was built on following the book and never taking risks," Rodriguez said with disgust. "When Operation Sandstorm went sideways and 6 soldiers died, he needed someone to blame. You were convenient because you had disobeyed his direct orders." "But I saved those children," Sarah protested, the old frustration bubbling up. "Doesn't that count for anything?" "Not when it threatens the narrative Webb was trying to build," Morrison replied. "He claimed that your actions compromised the mission, that if you had followed orders and waited for backup, the ambush could have been avoided. Of course, that was complete bullshit. The ambush was already in progress, and waiting for backup would have meant letting those kids burn to death." Thompson nodded grimly. Webb needed to show his superiors that the mission failure wasn't due to his poor planning or bad intelligence. It was easier to blame a sergeant who broke protocol than to admit that the entire operation was fundamentally flawed from the beginning. Sarah felt a familiar anger rising in her chest, the same rage that had sustained her through the court-martial and the appeals process that had ultimately failed. "So he destroyed my career to save his own." "He tried to," Morrison corrected. "But he didn't count on the fact that word of your actions would spread through the special operations community. Danny Jackson made sure that every medic and corpsman in the field heard about what you did. Master Chief Rodriguez here personally briefed 3 different SEAL teams on your tactical decisions under fire." Rodriguez smiled grimly. "What you did that day is textbook material now. We teach it as an example of how to make ethical decisions under extreme pressure. How to prioritize human life over mission parameters when the two come into conflict. Your actions are mentioned in the Navy SEAL Code of Ethics Training," Williams added. "Section on moral courage under fire. They don't use your name because of the classification issues, but every SEAL knows the story of Crimson Arrow." Sarah felt like she was in some kind of alternate reality where everything she thought she knew about her past was being turned upside down. For 3 years, she had carried the weight of believing that she had failed, that her career had ended in disgrace, that the 6 soldiers who died in that ambush had paid the price for her poor judgment. "But what about my squad?" she asked quietly. "Martinez, Johnson, Kowalski, Davis, Thompson, and Lee. They died because I disobeyed orders." Morrison leaned forward, his expression intense. "They died because General Webb sent them into an ambush without proper intelligence or adequate support. The investigation that was buried along with your commendation made it clear that the entire operation was compromised from the beginning." He pulled out a tablet and scrolled through what looked like an official military document. "This is the real after-action report from Operation Sandstorm, the one that Webb had classified to protect his career. It concludes that the mission was doomed from the moment your convoy left base, and that your actions were the only thing that prevented a complete catastrophe." Sarah stared at the document, seeing her name mentioned multiple times in terms of heroism and tactical brilliance rather than insubordination and recklessness. It was like reading about a different person, a version of herself that had been erased from her own memory by 3 years of guilt and shame. "According to this report," Morrison continued, "your decision to save those children actually bought your surviving squad members the time they needed to establish a defensive perimeter and call for extraction. If you had followed Webb's orders to maintain position, it's likely that the entire unit would have been overrun." Parker, the youngest of the SEALs, had been listening with rapt attention. "Ma'am, if you don't mind me asking, what happened to you after the discharge?" I mean, how did you end up? He trailed off, clearly unsure how to finish the question without being rude, but Sarah understood what he was asking. How had she gone from being Crimson Arrow, decorated war hero, to being the invisible woman in the corner of Murphy's bar? I fell apart, she said simply. Lost my apartment, lost most of my friends, lost my sense of purpose. Spent about 6 months drinking too much and feeling sorry for myself. Eventually, I pulled it together enough to get the graphic design work, but I never really figured out how to be a civilian. Have you thought about coming back? Rodriguez asked. I mean, your discharge was administrative, not criminal. With the right documentation and sponsorship, you could potentially re-enlist. Sarah shook her head immediately. I'm too old now. And, besides, who would want me? I'm damaged goods. Damaged goods? Morrison laughed, but there was no humor in it. Ma'am, you're 31 years old with more combat experience and tactical knowledge than 90% of the officers currently serving. You speak multiple languages, you have advanced medical training, and you've proven that you can make life or death decisions under the worst possible circumstances. More importantly, Thompson added, you've proven that you'll do the right thing even when it costs you everything. That's not damaged goods, that's exactly what we need more of in the military. Chen nodded enthusiastically. We're always looking for experienced personnel to help train the next generation. Someone like you could make a huge difference in how we prepare soldiers for the ethical challenges they'll face in the field. Sarah felt something stirring in her chest, a feeling she hadn't experienced in 3 years. Hope. The possibility that maybe her story wasn't over after all, that maybe Crimson Arrow wasn't just a memory to be buried and forgotten. But, even as part of her wanted to believe them, another part was still trapped in the fear and shame that had defined her civilian life. I appreciate what you're all saying, but you don't understand. I can't even handle a Friday night at a bar without having a panic attack. How am I supposed to go back to military life? Morrison's expression grew gentle. Ma'am, what you experienced tonight wasn't a panic attack. It was righteous anger at being disrespected and dismissed by someone who has no idea what you've sacrificed for this country. Any veteran would have had the same reaction. Besides, Rodriguez added with a grin, you handled that situation with more class and restraint than I would have. If some punk in a suit had said those things about my service, I probably would have thrown him through a window. The other SEALs chuckled, and Sarah found herself smiling for the first time in hours. There was something healing about being around people who understood, who didn't need her to explain or justify her reactions, who knew what it was like to carry the weight of decisions made in impossible circumstances. Williams checked his watch and frowned. It's getting late, and we've got an early flight tomorrow. But, before we go, there's something else we need to discuss. He looked at Morrison, who nodded and turned back to Sarah. We didn't just run into you by accident tonight. We're in town for a reason, and that reason involves you. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. What do you mean? Morrison pulled out an official-looking envelope and placed it on the table between them. Sarah could see her name written on the front in formal script, along with an official seal that she didn't recognize. 3 weeks ago, Ahmad Hassan's father reached out to our commanding officer through diplomatic channels. He's been trying to locate the American soldier who saved his son for the past 3 years, and he finally had enough influence and connections to make it happen. Sarah stared at the envelope, afraid to touch it. What does he want? He wants to thank you, Morrison said simply. Personally. He's invited you to attend Ahmad's graduation from medical school next month. The ceremony is being held at the new hospital that was built with funding from an international coalition, in large part because of the publicity surrounding the children you saved. Medical school? Sarah's voice came out as a whisper. But he was just 7 years old when I... He's 20 now, Chen explained gently. He accelerated through his studies with help from the international education programs that were established in the region. Turns out he's brilliant, has a natural gift for languages and science. And, according to his teachers, he's driven by a desire to save lives, just like the American soldier who saved him. Sarah's hands were shaking as she reached for the envelope. Inside was a formal invitation written in both English and Dari, along with a handwritten letter that began with the words, "To the angel of Crimson Arrow, whose courage gave me the gift of life and the dream of healing others." As she read Ahmed's letter, tears streaming down her face, Sarah felt something fundamental shift inside her. The guilt and shame that had weighed her down for 3 years began to lift, replaced by a growing sense of purpose and possibility. When she finished reading, she looked up to find 6 pairs of eyes watching her with understanding and respect. These men had sought her out, had come to find her specifically because her story mattered, because her sacrifice had made a difference that continued to ripple outward in ways she was only beginning to understand. "There's more," Morrison said quietly. "If you're interested, we've been authorized to offer you a consulting position with our training division. Nothing official, nothing that would require re-enlistment, but a chance to share your knowledge and experience with the next generation of special operations personnel." Sarah stared at him, hardly daring to believe what she was hearing. "You want me to teach?" "We want you to do what you do best," Rodriguez said with a smile. "Save lives. Show young soldiers how to make the right choices when everything is falling apart. Help them understand that sometimes breaking the rules is the most heroic thing you can do." For the first time in 3 years, Sarah Martinez felt like Crimson Arrow again. Not the broken, discharged soldier who had been court-martialed for disobeying orders, but the woman who had run into a burning bus to save children, who had chosen compassion over protocol, who had proven that sometimes the most important mission is the one that's not on any official orders. 6 months later, Sarah stood in front of a classroom full of Navy SEAL candidates at the Naval Special Warfare Training Center in Coronado, California. The morning sun streamed through the windows, illuminating 30 faces that looked impossibly young to her, though most of the candidates were probably only a few years younger than she was. She was wearing civilian clothes, dark slacks and a simple blue blouse, but she carried herself with the confidence that had been slowly rebuilding itself over the past half year. The transformation hadn't happened overnight. There had been therapy sessions to work through the PTSD she'd been ignoring for years, long conversations with Danny Jackson over video calls that helped her process the guilt she'd been carrying, and countless hours spent with Morrison and his team as they helped her prepare for this new chapter of her life. But the real turning point had been Ahmed's graduation ceremony. Sarah closed her eyes for a moment, remembering that incredible day in Kabul. She had been terrified to make the trip, convinced that seeing Ahmad as a young man would somehow shatter the carefully constructed narrative she'd built around that day in the desert. But when she'd walked into the ceremony hall and seen him standing there in his graduation robes, every fear had melted away. Ahmad had grown into a confident, articulate young man with his father's serious eyes and his mother's gentle smile. When he'd spotted Sarah in the crowd, his face had lit up with recognition and joy that had nearly brought her to her knees. He had rushed over to her, speaking in perfect English, and the first words out of his mouth had been, "Angel Sarah. I have dreamed of this day for so long." They had talked for hours afterward, Ahmad telling her about his studies, his plans to specialize in pediatric surgery, his dreams of opening a clinic in rural Afghanistan where children like his 7-year-old self could receive proper medical care. He had shown her photos of the other children from the bus, all alive, all thriving, all building futures that wouldn't have existed without her split-second decision to disobey orders. Fahima, the deaf girl, was now studying to become a teacher for hearing-impaired children. 2 of the boys were attending university in India on international scholarships. Another girl had started a non-profit organization dedicated to improving school safety in conflict zones. Each story was a testament to the ripple effects of courage, proof that one person's decision to do what was right could echo through generations. But the moment that had truly changed everything was when Ahmed's father, now a prominent local leader, had stood up at the ceremony dinner and delivered a speech about the American soldier who had saved his son. He had spoken in Dari, but there had been a translator present, and Sarah had listened with growing amazement as he described her actions with the kind of reverence usually reserved for historical heroes. "She came to us like an angel in the midst of hell," he had said. "She asked for nothing, expected nothing, and, when her own people punished her for her compassion, she bore it with dignity. She is what we hope our children will become, someone who chooses love over fear, courage over caution, humanity over politics." The entire room had risen in applause, and Sarah had found herself surrounded by people who wanted to shake her hand, to touch her, to thank her for what she had done. For the first time since her discharge, she had felt like a hero rather than a failure. Now, standing in front of these SEAL candidates, Sarah felt the weight of responsibility settle on her shoulders. These men would go on to make life and death decisions in some of the most dangerous places on Earth. What she taught them today might determine whether they came home alive, whether innocent civilians survived their missions, whether they could live with the choices they made in the heat of battle. "My name is Sarah Martinez," she began, her voice carrying clearly through the classroom. "Some of you might know me as Crimson Arrow. I'm here today to talk to you about something that isn't covered in your tactical manuals or strategic planning courses. I'm here to talk about moral courage." A few of the candidates shifted in their seats. This wasn't the typical military briefing they were used to. There were no PowerPoint slides, no technical diagrams, no discussion of weapons systems or battlefield tactics. Just a woman standing in front of them, speaking from hard-won experience. "How many of you have ever had to choose between following orders and doing what you knew was right?" Sarah asked. Several hands went up, though hesitantly. These were men who had been trained from day one to follow orders without question, to trust their chain of command even when they didn't understand the bigger picture. Sarah nodded. "It's one of the hardest positions a soldier can find themselves in. And if you serve long enough, if you see enough action, you will eventually face that choice. The question is, will you be prepared for it?" She walked over to a whiteboard and wrote 2 words, protocol and purpose. "Every military operation is built on protocol," she continued. "Rules of engagement, chain of command, standard operating procedures. These protocols exist for good reasons. They keep us alive, they ensure mission success, they maintain order in chaotic situations. But, sometimes, protocol and purpose come into conflict." A candidate in the front row raised his hand. "Ma'am, can you give us an example?" Sarah smiled grimly. 3 years ago, I was serving with the 101st Airborne in Afghanistan. My unit was tasked with convoy security along a supply route that intelligence had cleared as safe. The protocol was simple: maintain formation, follow the designated route, report any anomalies through proper channels. She paused, letting the weight of the memory settle over her. The purpose of our mission was to protect American lives and support our allies in the region. When our convoy was ambushed and a school bus full of Afghan children was caught in the crossfire, those 2 objectives came into direct conflict. The classroom was completely silent now. Sarah could see the intensity in their faces, the way they were hanging on every word. These men understood that this wasn't just a story, it was a preview of the kinds of impossible decisions they might face in the field. "My commanding officer ordered me to maintain position and wait for backup," Sarah continued. "Protocol demanded that I follow that order. But purpose, the deeper purpose of why we were there, why we had sworn to protect innocent life, demanded something different." She turned to face the class directly. "I chose purpose over protocol. I disobeyed a direct order and went into that burning bus to save 11 children. That decision saved 11 lives and ended my military career." A candidate in the back row spoke up. "Ma'am, do you regret it?" Sarah considered the question carefully. "I regret that my CO used my actions as a scapegoat to cover up his own failures. I regret that good soldiers died in that ambush because of poor intelligence and inadequate planning. I regret that it took me 3 years to understand that what I did was right, not wrong." She paused, looking each candidate in the eye. "But I don't regret saving those children. And if I found myself in the same situation tomorrow, I would make the same choice." Another hand went up. "Ma'am, how do we know when it's right to break protocol? How do we make that judgment in the moment?" Sarah walked back to the whiteboard and wrote a 3rd word, principles. "Every soldier needs to have a clear understanding of their core principles," she said. "Not just the mission parameters or the rules of engagement, but the fundamental values that define who they are and what they stand for. When protocol and purpose conflict, your principles are what guide you through that conflict." She turned back to the class. "For me, the principle was simple: protect innocent life whenever possible. Everything else, my career, my reputation, my relationship with my chain of command, was secondary to that principle. a young petty officer near the window raised his hand. But, ma'am, what if everyone just started disobeying orders whenever they felt like it? Wouldn't that lead to chaos? Sarah nodded approvingly. That's an excellent question, and it gets to the heart of the matter. I'm not advocating for wholesale disobedience or disregard for authority. What I'm talking about is the ability to recognize those rare moments when following orders would violate your fundamental principles as a human being. She walked over to a map of Afghanistan hanging on the wall. The key is understanding the difference between convenience and conscience. If you're tempted to disobey orders because they're difficult or dangerous or personally inconvenient, that's not moral courage, that's just selfishness. But, if following orders would require you to stand by and watch innocent people suffer when you have the power to help them, that's when your conscience should override your obedience. The discussion continued for another hour, with the candidates asking increasingly sophisticated questions about ethics, leadership, and decision-making under pressure. Sarah found herself drawing on experiences she hadn't thought about in years, sharing insights that came from the intersection of military training and hard-won wisdom. When the session finally ended, several candidates lingered to ask more personal questions. One of them, a young man who couldn't have been older than 22, approached her with obvious nervousness. "Ma'am, I just wanted to say thank you," he said quietly. "My little sister was killed in a car accident 2 years ago, and I've been struggling with why I'm here, why I want to serve. What you said about protecting innocent life, it helps me remember why this matters." Sarah felt her throat tighten with emotion. "What's your name, son?" "Petty Officer Martinez, ma'am." "No relation," he added with a shy smile. Sarah reached out and shook his hand. "Petty Officer Martinez, your sister would be proud of what you're doing here. And if you carry that motivation with you into the field, you're going to save lives and make a difference in ways you can't even imagine right now." As the candidates filed out of the classroom, Sarah felt a sense of completion that she hadn't experienced since her discharge. This was what she was meant to do, not just the technical aspects of military training, but the deeper work of helping young soldiers understand the moral complexity of their chosen profession. Commander Morrison appeared in the doorway as the last student left. He had been observing from the back of the room, and Sarah could see the satisfaction in his expression. "How do you think it went?" she asked. Morrison smiled. "I think you just gave 30 future SEALs something more valuable than any tactical training they'll receive. You gave them a framework for making the hardest decisions they'll ever face." He handed her a folder containing her schedule for the rest of the week. "You've got 3 more classes this week, plus a meeting with the training command about developing a formal ethics curriculum. And there's something else." Sarah raised an eyebrow. "What?" "Danny Jackson is flying in tomorrow. Apparently, he heard about your new position and wants to see you in action. He's also bringing someone with him." "Who?" Morrison's smile widened. "Ahmad Hassan. He's starting his residency at Johns Hopkins next month, and he specifically requested permission to visit the base where his angel is teaching the next generation of American warriors." Sarah felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes. The boy she had saved was now a doctor, just as he had dreamed, and he wanted to see where her own journey had led. It was a perfect circle, a completion of something that had started in the chaos of an Afghan desert and had led, through pain and redemption, to this moment. That evening, Sarah stood on the beach near the base, watching the sunset paint the Pacific Ocean in shades of gold and crimson. She thought about Trevor, the arrogant young man whose thoughtless cruelty had inadvertently set this entire transformation in motion. She wondered if he ever thought about that night at Murphy's bar, if he had learned anything from the experience, if he had gained any understanding of what real heroism looked like. She thought about General Webb, the commanding officer who had tried to destroy her career to save his own. According to Morrison, Webb was currently under investigation for multiple incidents of poor leadership and ethical violations. The truth about Operation Sandstorm had finally come to light, and Webb's carefully constructed reputation was crumbling under scrutiny. But, mostly, she thought about the journey that had brought her here, from the invisible woman in the corner of a bar to someone who was respected, valued, and trusted to shape the next generation of American warriors. It hadn't been easy, and there were still days when the old doubts and fears tried to creep back in. But she had learned something vital: sometimes you have to lose yourself completely before you can find out who you really are. Her phone buzzed with a text message from Ahmad, Dr. Ahmad Hassan reporting for duty. Cannot wait to see where Crimson Arrow is teaching heroes to fly. Your grateful friend always. Sarah smiled and typed back, welcome home, doctor. Can't wait to show you how much you've taught me about courage. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Sarah Martinez, former staff sergeant, former invisible woman, former victim of circumstances beyond her control, walked back toward the base with the confidence of someone who had finally figured out how to be exactly who she was meant to be. The next morning, she would stand in front of another classroom full of young warriors and teach them about moral courage. She would tell them about the importance of protecting innocent life, about the difference between protocol and purpose, about the moments when doing what's right matters more than doing what's safe. And, somewhere in the back of her mind, she would remember a little boy with a broken arm crying for his mother, and a deaf girl clutching desperately for her school bag, and the moment when she chose to run toward danger instead of away from it. Because that's what heroes do. They make the hard choices, they pay the price for their principles, and they inspire others to do the same. Sarah Martinez had been invisible for most of her life. But Crimson Arrow would never be invisible again.